The courthouse smelled of old wood polish and broken dreams. Irene Caldwell sat alone at the defendant's table, her navy blazer pressed sharp against her small frame, hands folded over a worn leather purse in her lap. Across the aisle, her stepson Trevor lounged in a chair that probably cost more than her monthly grocery bill, his expensive charcoal suit speaking louder than any words could. "Your Honor," Jonathan Pierce said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, "we're here today because an innocent man's final wishes have been perverted by a calculating woman who saw opportunity in an aging widower's loneliness." Irene felt the blood drain from her face. Around her, the sparse crowd of court spectators shifted uncomfortably. She caught sight of Gloria Patterson in the back row, her best friend of 40 years, whose expression had gone hard with anger. Pierce continued, pacing before Judge William Hamilton with the confidence of a man who'd already won. "Mrs. Caldwell married the deceased after a suspiciously brief courtship. She has no children of her own, no career to speak of, no independent source of income." He paused for effect, turning to look directly at Irene. "She was, by all accounts, nothing more than a housewife, entirely dependent on my client's father for financial support." Trevor leaned back in his chair, and that smirk, that same arrogant expression he'd worn since he was 12 years old, spread across his face. "Furthermore," Pierce said, warming to his theme, "Mrs. Caldwell isolated the deceased from his son, poisoning their relationship and ensuring her position as sole beneficiary of an estate worth $8.5 million. The number hung in the air like an accusation. Irene had never thought of Marcus's money as hers. It was just there, the foundation that allowed them to live comfortably while she took care of him, of their home, of the life they'd built together over 20 years. Judge Hamilton leaned forward, his gray temples catching the fluorescent light. "And what evidence do you have of this alleged manipulation, Mr. Pierce?" "We have documentation showing that Mrs. Caldwell actively discouraged my client from visiting his father during the final years of his life. Phone records, witness statements from neighbors who observed her controlling behavior." Irene wanted to stand up and scream. Those discouraged visits were because Trevor only came around when he needed money. Those phone records showed her desperately trying to reach Trevor when Marcus was dying, begging him to come home one last time. But how do you prove love? How do you demonstrate 20 years of caring for someone in a language the law understands? Pierce gestured toward her dismissively. "Your Honor, we're dealing with a classic case of elder abuse. A woman with no marketable skills, no education beyond high school, who latched onto a vulnerable man and systematically turned him against his only child." That's when Trevor spoke for the first time, his laugh echoing off the courtroom walls like a slap. "She's just a housewife," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your Honor, look at her. She can barely balance a checkbook, let alone understand the complexity of my father's estate. She probably doesn't even know what half those assets are worth." The courtroom fell silent, except for Trevor's chuckling. Judge Hamilton's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes when he looked at Irene. She sat perfectly still, her hands gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Inside that purse was the photograph of Marcus, thick-shouldered, dark-eyed, smiling that crooked smile that had first caught her attention 23 years ago at a charity gala. 20 years of morning coffee and evening wine, of birthday dinners and anniversary celebrations, of holding Marcus's hand through 2 surgeries and countless doctor's appointments, of being called just a housewife in a room full of strangers. But as Trevor's laughter faded and Pierce prepared to call his first witness, something stirred in Irene's chest. Not panic, not despair, calculation. She looked down at her hands, still steady despite the trembling in her soul, and thought about the box Gloria had brought from her basement. The box she hadn't opened in 20 years. The box that contained proof of who she'd been before she became Marcus Caldwell's wife. They have no idea who they're really dealing with, she thought. But I'm not ready to show them. Not yet. Rain hammered against the windows of St. Catherine's Episcopal Church as mourners filed past Marcus Caldwell's mahogany casket. Irene stood beside it in a simple black dress, her face dry of tears, not because she didn't feel the grief, but because she'd cried herself empty over the past 3 days. Marcus looked peaceful at least. That's what everyone kept saying. "He looks so peaceful, dear," as if dying at 70 from pancreatic cancer could ever be peaceful. She'd held his hand through the final hours, watching the morphine carry him away in slow waves. His last words had been clear, though. Crystal clear. "Don't let Trevor bully you, Irene. Promise me." She'd promised. But promises to the dead were easier to make than keep. The funeral service was beautiful. Gloria had made sure of that. Hymns Marcus loved. Readings from his favorite poets. But as Irene glanced around the church, one absence screamed louder than any eulogy. Trevor hadn't come. Oh, he'd sent flowers. An enormous arrangement of white lilies that probably cost $1,000. The card read, "Dad, sorry I couldn't make it. Important business in Seattle. T. Important business." On the day they buried his father, Gloria touched Irene's elbow gently. "You're shaking, honey." "Am I?" Irene looked down at her hands. They were trembling like leaves in a storm. "Come on, let's get you seated before the lawyers start." The will reading was scheduled for immediately after the service. Marcus's instructions. "Get it over with quickly," he'd written in his final wishes. "Don't let it drag on and torture Irene." But torture came in many forms. Marcus's attorney, James Mitchell, was a kind man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle manner that seemed out of place in his profession. He spread the will across the conference table in the church basement, adjusting his glasses as Trevor finally made his appearance, 45 minutes late, smelling faintly of airport bar and cologne. "Sorry," Trevor said without sounding sorry at all. Flight was delayed. He took a seat across from Irene, not meeting her eyes. James cleared his throat. "Let's begin. The last will and testament of Marcus Anthony Caldwell, executed on February 14th, 2024. He looked up. That was 6 months before his death, and I can attest that Marcus was of completely sound mind and body when we drafted this document. Trevor leaned forward, fingers drumming on the table. James continued reading, his voice steady and professional. To my beloved wife, Irene Margaret Caldwell, I leave the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to the family home at 1847 Oakwood Drive, all financial accounts, investments, and personal property, with an estimated total value of $8.5 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Trevor's face went from pale to red in the span of a heartbeat. What? Additionally, James read on, though his voice had grown quieter, I establish a trust fund for my son, Trevor Marcus Caldwell, in the amount of $24,000 per year, to be distributed in monthly installments of $2,000. This trust is irrevocable and cannot be borrowed against or sold. That's it? Trevor's voice cracked. $2,000 a month? That's what I get? James set down the will carefully. Marcus was very specific about this arrangement, Trevor. He wanted to ensure what? That he could punish me from beyond the grave? Trevor shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the linoleum. This is bullshit. This is her doing. Trevor, Irene started, but he cut her off. Don't you dare say my name. He jabbed a finger in her direction. You did this. You poisoned him against me. 20 years of whispering in his ear, and this is the result. Marcus made his own decisions, James said firmly. Mrs. Caldwell had nothing to do with the terms of this will. In fact, he glanced at Irene apologetically. In fact, she asked him to reconsider several times. She wanted you to receive more. Trevor laughed, bitter and sharp. Oh, how generous! How magnanimous! He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. You think you've won? You haven't. I'm going to fight this. I'm going to prove you manipulated him. Trevor, please, Irene said, standing now. Her legs felt unsteady. This isn't about winning or losing. Your father loved you. He wanted to control me, even after death. And you helped him do it. Trevor's eyes were bright with tears he refused to shed. I'll see you in court, stepmother. The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the cross on the wall. Irene sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted. Gloria was at her side immediately, one hand on her shoulder. That boy, Gloria muttered. That ungrateful, spoiled... He's hurting, Irene said quietly. He lost his father. He lost his father years ago, and it was his own damn fault. Gloria's voice was fierce. You've spent 20 years trying to build bridges to that boy, Irene. Don't you dare blame yourself for this. But Irene did blame herself, at least partially. Maybe if she'd tried harder. Maybe if she'd been different. Maybe if she hadn't been just... She stopped that thought before it could complete itself. James was gathering his papers, looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Caldwell, I should warn you. Given Trevor's reaction, it's likely he'll contest the will. You should prepare yourself for that possibility. Can he win? Gloria asked sharply. Unlikely. The will is airtight, and Marcus documented his reasoning extensively. But Trevor can make things difficult, expensive, time-consuming. Irene nodded slowly. I understand. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say with Gloria and James watching her with such concern, was that she'd known this was coming. Marcus had warned her. He'd seen it in Trevor's eyes during those final visits, the ones where Trevor stayed for 20 minutes and spent 15 of them checking his phone. He's going to fight you for it, Marcus had whispered one night, his voice weak from the morphine but his mind still sharp. Not because he needs the money, because he needs to win. He's always needed to win. Then maybe we should change the will, Irene had suggested. Give him more. Avoid the fight. Marcus had squeezed her hand with what little strength he had left. No, the fight is the point, Irene. He needs to lose something, finally, and understand what that feels like. Maybe then he'll grow up. And if he doesn't? Marcus's smile had been sad. Then at least you'll be protected. That's all I care about now. Protecting you. Irene was in the garden when the process server arrived. She'd been trying to prune Marcus's rose bushes, the yellow ones he'd planted for their 10th anniversary, but her hands had forgotten the rhythm of it. Everything felt foreign now. The house, the garden, even her own reflection in the bathroom mirror each morning. Mrs. Irene Caldwell. She looked up to find a young man in a rumpled suit standing on the flagstone path, holding a manila envelope like it might explode. Yes? I'm very sorry, ma'am. And he did look sorry as he handed her the envelope. You've been served. The envelope felt heavier than it should. She stood in the garden for a long moment after the server left, dirt under her fingernails, Marcus's pruning shears still in her other hand. Inside the house, Gloria was making tea. She'd been coming over almost daily since Marcus died, bringing casseroles and company and an endless supply of practical wisdom. But when she saw Irene's face, the kettle stopped mid-pour. What is it? Irene opened the envelope with shaking hands. Complaint for declaratory relief and accounting. Trevor Marcus Caldwell, plaintiff versus Irene Margaret Caldwell. Defendant. The words blurred as she scanned the document. Undue influence, elder abuse, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, constructive trust. He's actually doing it, Irene whispered. Gloria snatched the papers from her hands, reading quickly. Her expression darkened with each page. I'm sorry, Irene. I know he's grieving, but this is unconscionable. Elder abuse? Marcus was sharp as a tack until the day he died. Irene sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the same chairs where she and Marcus had shared breakfast every morning for 20 years. He thinks I stole it. He really thinks I manipulated Marcus. Then he's delusional. Gloria slapped the complaint onto the table. You need a lawyer, a good one. This Pierce fellow, I've heard of him. He's a shark. I know. Irene's voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. James gave me some names. I called 3 firms yesterday. And they all want $25,000 up front, retainer fees. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. The estate is frozen until this is resolved. I have $3,000 in my personal checking account. That's it. Gloria's face went pale. He froze the accounts? He can do that? With a lawsuit like this, the court can freeze assets to prevent dissipation. That's what James said. Irene rubbed her temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. I can apply for living expenses, but it takes time, and meanwhile the property taxes are due next month. The mortgage, the utilities. You can stay with me. Gloria, no. Thank you, but no. Irene straightened her shoulders, trying to summon some dignity. I'm not leaving my home. Marcus wanted me to have it. I'm going to fight for it. With what? You just said you can't afford a lawyer. Then I'll represent myself. The silence that followed was heavy with doubt. Irene, honey, Gloria said gently. You haven't worked in 20 years, and even before that you were… She stopped, searching for diplomatic words. You were a housewife to your first husband before Marcus. No offense, but going up against a professional attorney when you've never even… I know. Irene cut her off, not unkindly. I know how it looks, but what choice do I have? That night, after Gloria left with promises to research pro bono lawyers, Irene sat alone in Marcus's study. She'd barely been able to enter this room since his death. It still smelled like him, old books and pipe tobacco and that sandalwood cologne he wore. His computer sat dark on the desk. His reading glasses lay folded beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. His life, frozen in time. She picked up the phone and dialed Trevor's number. It rang 4 times before he answered. What? No greeting? No hello? Just what? Dripping with contempt. Trevor, it's Irene. I know who it is. What do you want? She took a breath, steadying herself. I want to understand why you're doing this. We can talk. We can work something out without… Without what? Without exposing you for what you really are? His voice was cold. You stole my father from me. First his attention, then his love, and now his legacy. Did you think I'd just let that slide? I never stole anything. I loved your father. He loved you. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. Trevor laughed, harsh and bitter. You know what's funny? I actually believed that for a while. I thought maybe, just maybe, you weren't like all the others. But here we are, 8.5 million reasons for me to see the truth. Trevor, please, save it for the judge. Oh, wait, you won't have a lawyer to speak for you, will you? I heard about your little money problem. That must be rough. The line went dead. Irene sat holding the phone, listening to the dial tone, feeling something crack inside her chest. Not her heart, that had already broken when Marcus died. Something else. Something that had been holding her together through sheer force of will. She set down the phone carefully and opened the bottom drawer of Marcus's desk. Inside was a small cardboard box, sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. Gloria had brought it from Irene's basement yesterday, insisting she might need important documents. Irene had almost thrown it away. Now she pulled it onto her lap and stared at the box for a long moment. 20 years. It had been 20 years since she'd looked inside. 20 years since she'd been the person these contents represented. Her fingers found the edge of the tape. Not yet, she decided. Not until she had no other choice. But soon, she pushed the box back into the drawer and locked it. Tomorrow she would face Jonathan Pierce and Trevor in court for the first time. She would sit at that defendant's table alone without counsel and try to defend 20 years of love against accusations of greed. And she would do it as Irene Caldwell, housewife and widow. For now, at least. Irene stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her navy blazer for the 5th time. The outfit was 10 years old, the same one she'd worn to Marcus's company dinners back when he could still attend them. It was professional enough, she hoped. Dignified. It made her look exactly like what Trevor claimed she was, a housewife playing dress-up. Behind her reflection, she could see the cardboard box sitting on her bed. Gloria had insisted on bringing it this morning. Just in case, Gloria had said. You never know what you might need. But Irene knew what was in that box, and she wasn't ready. Not yet. Maybe not ever. You look beautiful, Gloria said from the doorway, though her voice carried doubt. Strong. I look terrified. That too. Gloria came in and sat on the bed beside the box, her hand resting on it almost protectively. Irene, honey, I've known you for 40 years. I was there when you married Marcus. I was there when you tried so hard to win Trevor over. I was there when you sat by Marcus's bedside every single day for 6 months while he died. Gloria, let me finish. Gloria's voice was fierce. I've watched you give and give and give. For 20 years, I've watched you make yourself smaller so other people could be bigger. And I've never said anything because it made you happy. But now?" She gestured toward the lawsuit papers on the dresser. "Now I'm saying something. You don't have to be small anymore." Irene looked at the box, then away. "I chose this life. I don't regret it." "I know you don't, but that doesn't mean you have to keep living it, especially when it's based on lies." "They're not lies? Then what do you call hiding who you really are?" The question hung in the air between them. Irene had no answer. The courtroom was smaller than Irene expected and older. The kind of place where wood paneling had turned dark with age and the air conditioning never quite worked right. A handful of spectators dotted the gallery, court watchers and law students mostly, drawn by the promise of drama in an inheritance dispute. Trevor and Jonathan Pierce sat at the plaintiff's table, looking every inch the part of righteous grievance. Pierce was in his mid-40s, handsome in that practiced way of successful attorneys, with silver threading through his dark hair. He wore confidence like cologne. Trevor had dressed more carefully than Irene had ever seen him. No expensive flashiness today, just a somber charcoal suit and a tie that suggested grief more than anger. He'd learned to play the part. Judge William Hamilton entered, and everyone rose. He was younger than Irene expected, maybe mid-50s with gray temples and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He settled into his chair with the comfortable authority of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Be seated. We're here for the matter of Caldwell versus Caldwell, case number PR 248847. Mr. Pierce, your opening statement." Pierce rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor." What followed was 45 minutes of character assassination so thorough and methodical that Irene felt herself shrinking with each word. Pierce painted a picture of a calculating woman who'd swooped into a widower's life with mercenary precision. He produced a timeline showing that Irene had married Marcus only 6 months after their first meeting. He referenced her lack of education and employment history at least 5 times. He implied, without quite stating, that a younger woman marrying an older wealthy man could only have one motivation. And through it all, Trevor sat perfectly still, his face arranged in an expression of wounded betrayal. When Pierce finally sat down, Judge Hamilton turned to Irene. "Mrs. Caldwell, would you like to make an opening statement?" Every eye in the courtroom fixed on her. Irene stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She had notes, 3 pages of handwritten points she'd agonized over until 2 in the morning, but when she looked down at them, the words blurred. "Your Honor, She cleared her throat. "I loved my husband. For 20 years I took care of him. I made his favorite meals. I drove him to doctor's appointments. I held his hand when he was scared. I was there every single day of his illness. That's not manipulation. That's marriage." Her voice cracked on the last word. Judge Hamilton's expression remained neutral. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell. You may be seated." It was over in less than a minute. 45 minutes of accusations, answered by 60 seconds of trembling sincerity. Pierce stood again. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness, Mrs. Elizabeth Parker." Irene's neighbor, a woman she'd helped carry groceries when her hip was bad, who she'd brought soup to when she had the flu, walked to the witness stand without looking at her. Pierce's examination was surgical. Yes, Mrs. Parker had observed tension between Marcus and Trevor. Yes, she'd seen Irene hovering whenever Trevor visited. And yes, this was the damaging part, she'd heard Irene say something troubling. "Can you tell the court what you heard?" Pierce asked. Mrs. Parker's hands twisted in her lap. "It was maybe 2 months before Marcus died. I was in my garden and Irene was on her porch. She was crying. She said..." Mrs. Parker glanced at Irene apologetically. "She said, 'I gave up everything for him. Trevor will try to take it all away from me.'" The courtroom was silent. "Take it all away," Pierce repeated. Those were her exact words? "Yes." "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. No further questions." Judge Hamilton looked at Irene. "Mrs. Caldwell." Cross-examination. Irene stood again, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. She had no idea what she was doing, no strategy, no training. "Mrs. Parker," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "When you heard me say that, "I just come from the doctor's office that morning. Do you remember?" Mrs. Parker nodded. "I think so." "Do you remember what the doctor told Marcus and me that day?" A pause. "No." "He told us the treatments weren't working, that Marcus had maybe 6 weeks left." Irene's voice grew stronger, fueled by grief and memory. "So when I said I gave up everything, I wasn't talking about money. I was talking about time, about dreams, about the future we'd planned. And when I said Trevor would try to take it all away, I meant—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "I meant he'd try to rewrite our story, make it about greed instead of love." Mrs. Parker's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." But Pierce was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Mrs. Caldwell is testifying, not questioning." "Sustained," Judge Hamilton said gently. "Mrs. Caldwell, please confine yourself to questions." But the damage was already done. To Irene, not to Pierce's case. She'd fumbled it, made herself look like an amateur. She sat down, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Pierce called 2 more witnesses. Marcus's banker testified about large sums being moved around in Marcus's final months. Reorganizing that Pierce suggested was actually Irene securing assets. A former colleague of Marcus's claimed he'd seemed confused during their last conversation. With each witness, Irene tried to cross-examine, and with each attempt, she fell further behind. She asked the wrong questions. She let Pierce's objections fluster her. She watched her credibility crumble like sand. By the time Judge Hamilton called for a lunch recess, Irene felt hollowed out, defeated before the real battle had even begun. Trevor approached her table as the courtroom emptied, Pierce at his side. "This is going well," Trevor said quietly, though there was no triumph in his voice, just exhaustion. "You should settle. Take 10% and walk away. It's more generous than you deserve." Irene looked up at him. This man she'd tried so hard to love, who'd been 12 years old and broken when she'd first entered his life. She'd made him pancakes, helped with homework, attended school plays where he'd pretended not to see her. 20 years of trying. "I'm not settling," she heard herself say. "Then you're a fool." Trevor turned away, but Pierce lingered for a moment. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, and there was something almost kind in his voice. "This is going to get uglier. You're outmatched here. No shame in admitting it." When they were gone, Irene sat alone in the empty courtroom. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, painting everything in amber. She could hear muted sounds from the hallway, lawyers conferring, court staff laughing about something. She thought about Marcus, about that night 6 months ago when he'd squeezed her hand and said, "Don't let Trevor bully you." She thought about the cardboard box sitting in Gloria's car. She thought about who she'd been 20 years ago, before she'd chosen love over everything else. And she thought about Trevor's laugh echoing off these walls. She's just a housewife. Irene stood slowly, smoothing her skirt with hands that had finally stopped shaking. She walked out of the courtroom, past Gloria waiting in the hallway, past the courthouse steps where Trevor and Pierce stood smoking and strategizing. She drove home in silence, and that night, for the first time in 20 years, she opened the box. The cardboard box sat on Marcus's desk like a time bomb. Irene had carried it up from Gloria's car, set it down in the study, and then spent 20 minutes staring at it while nursing a glass of Marcus's scotch. The good stuff. The bottle he'd been saving for a celebration that never came. The tape came away easily, too easily, as if 20 years had weakened its hold. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, were the artifacts of a life she'd almost convinced herself she'd imagined. Her diploma from Harvard Law School, summa cum laude. The Latin words looked foreign now, like a language she'd once been fluent in but had forgotten through disuse. Beneath it, a certificate of appointment. Superior Court Judge, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The date, June 15th, 1999. She'd been 28 years old, the youngest person ever appointed to that position. Newspaper clippings, carefully folded, headlines that made her stomach clench with equal parts pride and grief. Judge Hartwell delivers landmark ruling on corporate liability. The Iron Judge. How Irene Hartwell is reshaping civil litigation. Rising star on the bench. Hartwell considered for federal appointment. Judge Hartwell. That's who she'd been. Not Irene Caldwell, housewife and widow. Irene Hartwell, legal prodigy. The judge who'd made senior partners at white shoe law firms break into nervous sweats. The judge who'd been mentioned, seriously mentioned, for the federal bench before she'd turned 35. At the bottom of the box was a photograph she'd forgotten existed. Her younger self in judicial robes, being sworn in, one hand on a Bible and the other raised. Her father stood beside her, beaming with pride. He'd been gone 15 years now, and beneath the photograph, folded into a small square, was a piece of paper she didn't recognize. Irene unfolded it with trembling fingers. Marcus's handwriting, his terrible doctor's scrawl that she'd learned to decipher over 20 years. My dearest Irene, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and Trevor has likely challenged the will. I knew he would. That's why I never told him who you really were. He needed to underestimate you. Do you remember the night we met? That charity gala in 2003? You were there under your maiden name, trying to have one evening where you weren't Judge Hartwell. And I was just a corporate attorney who'd lost his wife 2 years earlier and didn't know how to talk to his angry 12-year-old son. You told me you were between careers. I didn't know what that meant until months later, when Gloria let it slip after too much wine at dinner. By then, I was already in love with you. Not with Judge Hartwell, but with Irene, the woman who laughed at my bad jokes and made Trevor smile for the first time in 2 years. When you told me you were considering early retirement, I asked if you were sure. You said, I've spent 15 years being important. Maybe it's time to just be happy. You sacrificed everything for us. For me. For a broken family that needed healing more than it deserved you. I've kept your secret all these years because that's what you wanted. But I always knew that someday you might need to remember who you were. Who you still are. Beneath all those years of being just a wife. You're the strongest, most brilliant woman I've ever known. Trevor doesn't know this. Pierce doesn't know this. They're about to find out. Don't let them take what you earned. Don't let them diminish what you are. Show them the Iron Judge. All my love. Always. Marcus. Irene read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with tears that finally spilled over. Marcus had known. Of course he'd known. He'd always known exactly who she was, what she'd given up, and what she was still capable of. She set down the letter carefully and picked up her law degree. The paper was thick, expensive, official, the kind of document that opened doors and commanded respect. 20 years ago, she'd been destined for the Supreme Court. Law clerks had competed to work for her. Attorneys had studied her opinions like scripture. She'd been Judge Irene Hartwell, a force of nature in a black robe. Then she'd met Marcus at that charity gala. A widower struggling to raise his angry son. A good man who'd looked at her like she was just Irene, not a stepping stone to career advancement. And for the first time in 15 years of ruthless ambition, she'd wanted something more than the next rung on the ladder. She'd wanted love, family, a life that wasn't measured in precedents and appellate decisions. So she'd retired, taken Marcus's name, become a stepmother to a boy who'd never wanted her. And for 20 years, she'd been happy, genuinely, deeply happy. But happiness and power weren't the same thing. Irene stood and walked to Marcus's bookshelf. His law books, outdated now, but comprehensive. She ran her fingers along the spines, remembering. Williston on contracts, Prosser on torts, the restatement of property. Her hands found one they were looking for without conscious thought. Massachusetts practice, probate law, and practice. She pulled it down and opened it to the chapter on will contests. The words came back to her like muscle memory. Undue influence, burden of proof, required elements, defenses. Pierce's case was weak. She could see it now, with eyes that had spent 15 years evaluating evidence and finding holes in arguments. He had circumstantial evidence and innuendo. He had a sympathetic client and a good story, but he had no proof. More importantly, she had defenses. Real ones. Irene opened Marcus's laptop. The password was their anniversary, and did something she hadn't done in 20 years. She logged into Westlaw, the legal research database. Her old credentials still worked. Apparently, Harvard Law never deactivated alumni accounts. For the next 6 hours, she read case law, recent opinions, probate procedures in Massachusetts. Everything had changed, and nothing had changed. The fundamentals were still there, solid as bedrock. And with each case she read, each precedent she internalized, she felt something awakening inside her. Not anger, not vengeance, competence. By 2 a.m, she had a plan. Not a perfect plan. She was rusty, and she'd need time to shake off 20 years of disuse. But it was a plan, a real one. Pierce thought he was facing a helpless housewife. He was about to face Judge Irene Hartwell, and she was very, very good at her job. Irene woke at 6, her mind already racing with the kind of clarity she hadn't felt in years. She made coffee, Marcus's French press, the way he'd taught her, and returned to the study. Marcus's computer was a treasure trove if you knew where to look, and Irene knew. The first obstacle was his financial files, protected by a password she didn't know. She tried their anniversary, their wedding date, Trevor's birthday. Nothing worked. Then she remembered something from their 10th anniversary. Marcus had given her a collection of legal poetry, an obscure gift that only a fellow lawyer would appreciate. His favorite had been a sonnet about justice and love, written by an 18th century judge. He'd made her memorize the first line. Justice and love, 2 pillars of the soul. The year was harder. When was it written? 1747, 1847? She tried variations. Nothing. Then she noticed a small card tucked into the corner of Marcus's desk calendar. A business card for their favorite restaurant where they'd celebrated every anniversary. On the back, in Marcus's handwriting, J&L 1947. She typed, Justice and Love 1947. The computer unlocked. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, "you made sure I'd find this." The financial folder was meticulously organized. Marcus had always been thorough. But as Irene dug deeper, she found a subfolder labeled simply, Trevor. Inside were 17 PDFs. Each one was a bank transfer record going back 15 years. March 2009, $5,000. Emergency car repair. August 2010, $8,000. Security deposit on apartment. January 2012, $12,000. Business investment opportunity. The list went on and on. Irene did the math twice to make sure she wasn't wrong. $137,000. Trevor had borrowed $137,000 from his father over 15 years. None of it had been repaid. Most of it, according to Marcus's notes, had been spent on investments that never materialized and emergencies that happened with suspicious regularity. But it was the most recent entry that made Irene's breath catch. October 2023, $15,000. Casino debt. Urgent. Marcus's note beneath it. Called me at 2 a.m. crying. Said he'd lose his apartment if he didn't pay. I paid. Again. But this is the last time. He needs to hit bottom, or he'll never learn. 2 months before Marcus died. 2 months before Trevor stopped visiting altogether. Irene kept digging. She found correspondence with Marcus's financial advisor, James Mitchell, discussing the will. James, I need to make changes. Trevor called last night, drunk I think, asking when I was going to hurry up and die so he could finally get what's his. He thought I'd fallen asleep. I heard every word. I've spent 35 years trying to teach my son responsibility. I've failed. But I won't fail Irene. She sacrificed everything for this family. She deserves to be protected. Change the will. Everything to Irene, except a trust fund for Trevor. Make it modest. Make it irrevocable. Make it so he has to learn to live within his means for once in his life. And James, if he contests this, make sure Irene has everything she needs to fight. She's stronger than she knows. Marcus Irene sat back, her hands shaking. Not from fear, from fury. Trevor had told the court that Irene had poisoned his relationship with Marcus. The truth was Trevor had done that himself, one drunken phone call at a time. She saved everything to a flash drive. Evidence, proof, ammunition. Dr. Patricia Wells had been Marcus's oncologist for the final 6 months. Irene called her office first thing in the morning. Dr. Wells' office, how may I help you? This is Irene Caldwell. I need to speak with Dr. Wells about my late husband, Marcus Caldwell. A pause. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm so sorry for your loss, but I can't discuss patient information. I'm the executor of his estate. I have authorization. Irene kept her voice professional, firm. I need documentation of his cognitive function during his final months. It's for a legal matter. Another pause. Hold, please. 5 minutes later, Dr. Wells came on the line. Mrs. Caldwell, I heard about the lawsuit. I'm sorry you're going through this. Thank you. I know what you need, and I already prepared it. Dr. Wells' voice was crisp, professional. When Trevor stopped visiting, Marcus told me why. He suspected Trevor might challenge the will, so we did a full cognitive assessment 1 month before Marcus died. Mini mental state examination, Montreal cognitive assessment, the works. Irene's heart was pounding. And he scored in the 98th percentile. His mind was sharp as ever. The cancer was killing his body, but his brain was fine. A pause. I'll have my office send you copies of everything. Officially notarized. Admissible in court. Dr. Wells, I can't thank you enough. Don't thank me. Marcus was a good man. What Trevor is doing is unconscionable. Her voice softened. And Mrs. Caldwell? Marcus talked about you a lot in those final sessions. He said you were the best thing that ever happened to him. He said you were much stronger than you believed. I think he was right. After they hung up, Irene sat for a long moment, staring at the phone. Marcus had prepared for this. All of it. He'd documented everything, knowing Trevor would attack, knowing Irene would need ammunition. He'd been protecting her, even after death. Irene spent the morning organizing her evidence, preparing her cross-examination strategy for Pierce's remaining witnesses. She was deep in case law when she noticed a folder on Marcus's computer she'd missed. Personal, do not open. She opened it. Inside was a document titled simply, For Irene, in case of emergency. It was a video file, dated 2 months before Marcus died. Irene clicked play. Marcus appeared on screen, sitting in this very study. He looked thin, ravaged by illness, but his eyes were clear, alert. The eyes of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Irene, he said, and even through the computer speakers, his voice wrapped around her like a hug. If you're watching this, then Trevor has done exactly what I thought he'd do. And you're fighting him. Good. You should fight him. Marcus adjusted his position, wincing slightly. I need to tell you some things. Things I should have told you while I was alive, but... He smiled sadly. I was a coward. I didn't want to poison your relationship with Trevor any more than it already was. He pulled out a folder, the same folder Irene had found with the loan records. Trevor has borrowed $137,000 from me over the years. He's never paid back a penny, but that's not the worst part. Marcus looked directly into the camera, and Irene could see the pain in his eyes. 3 months ago, I overheard him on the phone. He was talking to someone, a friend, I assume. He said, and I quote, "The old man's finally dying. Just a few more weeks and I'll have enough to cover all my debts and then some. The housewife won't know what hit her." Irene's hands flew to her mouth. He thought I was asleep, Marcus continued, his voice hollow. Or maybe he didn't care. Either way, I heard him, and it broke my heart, Irene. Not because of the money, because I realized my son was counting down the days until I died. Marcus wiped his eyes, composing himself. So I changed the will. I'd already been planning to leave you most of it. You earned it, God knows. But I'd intended to give Trevor 40%. After that phone call, I gave him the trust fund. Just enough to live on if he's responsible. Not enough to bail him out of his mistakes. He leaned forward, his expression fierce despite his weakness. If he's challenging the will now, it's because he's desperate. He owes money to someone, probably casino debts, knowing Trevor. He needs that inheritance to save himself. Marcus's voice softened. Don't let him bully you, Irene. You're not just a housewife. You never were. You're the woman who was brilliant enough to make it to the Superior Court at 28. You're the woman who gave up everything because you had the courage to choose love over power. That takes more strength than Trevor will ever understand. The video ended with Marcus looking directly at the camera. I love you, Irene. Fight for what's yours. You've earned it 1,000 times over. The screen went black. Irene sat in the darkness of the study, tears streaming down her face. Marcus had known. He'd seen Trevor's true nature, documented it, and protected her from it. And now she had the smoking gun that would destroy Pierce's entire case. But as she saved the video file and prepared to add it to her evidence, something else caught her eye. A notification on Marcus's email, an unread message from 3 months ago, just after Marcus died. The sender, vlangford@securemail.com. The subject line, we need to talk about Marcus Caldwell. Irene clicked it open. Mr. Caldwell, by the time you read this, you'll probably be gone. I'm sorry we never got to meet in person. I'm sorry you refused to acknowledge me. But DNA doesn't lie. I'm your daughter. My mother was Sarah Langford. You were married to her for 8 months in 1985 before the annulment. She gave me up for adoption, but I found the records. I found you. I deserve a share of your estate. If you won't give it to me willingly, I'll take it by force. Your daughter, Victoria Langford. Irene read the email 3 times, her mind racing. Marcus had mentioned this. Once. She'd forgotten until now. About a year ago, he'd received a letter from someone claiming to be his daughter. He'd had his attorney look into it. The DNA test had been inconclusive. More importantly, Marcus had never been married to anyone named Sarah Langford. His first wife, Trevor's mother, had been Linda. And before that, he'd been too focused on law school to date seriously. Victoria Langford was either delusional or a con artist. But if she was planning to contest the will too... Irene picked up her phone and called James Mitchell. James, it's Irene. I need you to pull something for me. Everything you have on a woman named Victoria Langford. Victoria. James paused. Wait, is this about that woman who claimed to be Marcus's daughter? Yes. What do you know about her? Marcus had me investigate. She's a professional scammer. We found 3 other estates where she filed similar claims. The DNA test she sent Marcus was fake. We had our own test done with her discarded coffee cup. No match. 0 relation. Did you tell Marcus this? Of course. He wanted to file a police report, but then he got sicker, and... James sighed. We never followed through. Irene, why are you asking about this now? Because she emailed Marcus 3 months ago. She said she'd take it by force if he didn't acknowledge her claim. A long silence. You think she's involved with Trevor's lawsuit? I don't know, but I'm going to find out. After hanging up, Irene sat back and stared at her evidence board, an actual corkboard she'd set up in the study, covered with documents and timeline notes. She'd become an investigator again without even realizing it. Trevor's case was built on lies. Pierce's reputation was apparently built on aggressive tactics that crumbled against prepared opponents. And somewhere in the background, a professional con artist was watching this case, waiting for her opportunity. The pieces were coming together. Tomorrow was the second day of trial. Tomorrow, Pierce would call his expert witnesses. Tomorrow, Trevor would take the stand. And tomorrow, Judge Irene Hartwell would show them all who she really was. Irene arrived at the courthouse at 8:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the session began. She wore the same navy blazer, but something about her was different. Her hair, usually pulled back in a soft bun, was styled more severely. Professional. Her spine was straighter, her steps more measured. Gloria noticed immediately. You look different. I am different. Irene set down her briefcase, Marcus's old leather briefcase, which she'd filled with documents last night. I'm ready. Ready for what? Irene smiled, and it wasn't the gentle smile of the grieving widow. It was the smile of a judge who just spotted a fatal flaw in an attorney's argument. Ready to fight. The courtroom filled quickly. Word had spread that this was more than just another inheritance dispute. The gallery was fuller than yesterday. More law students, more court watchers, even a reporter from the local legal journal. Trevor noticed Irene's transformation, too. He leaned over to whisper something to Pierce, who glanced at her and frowned. Judge Hamilton entered promptly at 9. All rise. When everyone was seated, he shuffled his papers and looked up. Mr. Pierce, you may call your next witness. Thank you, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Dr. Richard Thompson. The medical expert was exactly what Irene expected. Mid-60s, gray beard, impressive credentials listed in his CV. Board certified in geriatric psychiatry. Expert witness in over 50 cases involving elderly cognitive decline. Pierce walked him through his qualifications, then moved to the meat of his testimony. Dr. Thompson, did you have an opportunity to review the medical records of Marcus Caldwell? I did. And based on those records, what is your professional opinion regarding his mental state in the months before his death? Dr. Thompson adjusted his glasses. In my expert opinion, Mr. Caldwell showed signs of cognitive decline consistent with his advanced age and medical condition. Pancreatic cancer patients often experience what we call chemo brain, difficulty with memory, concentration, and decision-making. And would this cognitive decline make him more susceptible to undue influence? Absolutely. Patients in this state are often highly dependent on their primary caregiver and may be easily influenced. Objection. Every head in the courtroom turned. Irene was on her feet, her voice clear and steady. Judge Hamilton looked surprised. On what grounds, Mrs. Caldwell? The witness is speculating, Your Honor. He never examined Marcus Caldwell. He's testifying about cognitive decline based on general statistics, not specific evaluation of the decedent. Pierce was on his feet. Your Honor, Dr. Thompson is a qualified expert. Who never met my husband, Irene cut in. Who never spoke to him, examined him, or administered any cognitive assessment. He's giving a theoretical opinion about a man he never knew. Judge Hamilton leaned forward, suddenly very interested. Dr. Thompson, when did you last examine Marcus Caldwell? The doctor shifted uncomfortably. I never personally examined him. I reviewed his medical history and... You reviewed records from 14 months before his death, Irene said, pulling out a document. The most recent evaluation in those records is from September 2023. Marcus died in January 2025. 16 months of medical history you haven't seen. 16 months that included his primary cancer treatment. Pierce was pale. Your Honor, this is cross-examination. Mrs. Caldwell should wait. I'll allow it, Judge Hamilton said, and there was something new in his voice. Interest. Continue, Mrs. Caldwell. Irene approached the witness stand, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt completely in control. Dr. Thompson, are you aware that Marcus Caldwell underwent a full cognitive assessment 1 month before his death? No, that wasn't in the records I received. That's because Mr. Pierce didn't provide them to you, did he? Irene produced a document. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence the complete cognitive assessment performed by Dr. Patricia Wells, Mr. Caldwell's oncologist, on December 15, 2024. She handed copies to the judge, to Pierce, and to the witness. Pierce's face went from pale to gray as he scanned the document. Dr. Thompson, Irene continued yet, can you read for the court the overall score on the Montreal Cognitive Assessment? Dr. Thompson cleared his throat. 29 out of 30. And what does that indicate? Normal cognitive function. His voice was barely audible. I'm sorry, can you repeat that for the court? Normal cognitive function. No signs of impairment. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Hamilton banged his gavel once. Order. Irene turned to Pierce. Your Honor, I move to strike Dr. Thompson's testimony as based on incomplete information and lacking foundation. Motion granted. Judge Hamilton's voice was crisp. The jury will disregard Dr. Thompson's testimony. As the doctor stepped down, looking thoroughly embarrassed, Judge Hamilton fixed Irene with a penetrating stare. Mrs. Caldwell, that was impressive cross-examination. Very precise. Where did you learn to examine witnesses like that? This was it. The moment she'd been both dreading and anticipating. The courtroom was completely silent, waiting for her answer. Your Honor, I need to make a disclosure to the court. Pierce stood. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Sit down, Mr. Pierce. Judge Hamilton's voice had an edge now. Mrs. Caldwell, you have the floor. Irene took a breath, feeling the weight of 20 years lifting off her shoulders. My full legal name is Irene Margaret Caldwell, but 20 years ago, I was known professionally as Irene Margaret Hartwell. She paused, letting the name hang in the air. Recognition dawned in Judge Hamilton's eyes. Hartwell? As in, Judge Hartwell? Yes, Your Honor. I served as a Superior Court judge in Massachusetts for 15 years. I retired in 2004 to marry Marcus. The courtroom exploded. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Law students gasped. The court sketch artist's hand froze mid-stroke. Trevor shot to his feet, his face twisted in disbelief and rage. What? That's impossible. You're just a housewife? Irene finished for him, her voice carrying across the courtroom. Yes, Trevor, I heard you yesterday. But before I was a housewife, I was one of the youngest Superior Court judges in Massachusetts history. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law. I was being considered for federal appointment before I turned 35. She turned to Judge Hamilton. I retired from the bench to marry Marcus and help raise his son. I took his name. I stepped away from public life. But my bar membership is still active. I've maintained my continuing legal education requirements. I am qualified to represent myself in this matter. Pierce looked like he might be sick. He was shuffling through papers frantically, as if he could find some magic solution to the disaster unfolding before him. Judge Hamilton was staring at Irene with something approaching awe. Judge Hartwell, the Morrison case, 2002. You remember it? I was second chair on the defense. You destroyed us in 45 minutes. A smile tugged at his lips. You were brilliant. Terrifying, but brilliant. Trevor finally found his voice. This is insane. Why would a judge become a housewife? This has to be some kind of fraud. It's not fraud, Trevor. Irene's voice was gentle now, almost sad. It's called love. I chose love over ambition. I chose a life with your father over a career path to the Supreme Court. I don't regret it, but that doesn't mean I forgot how to practice law. She turned to Pierce, who was still standing, frozen in shock. Mr. Pierce, yesterday you spent 45 minutes telling this court that I was uneducated, incompetent, a gold digger who couldn't understand the complexity of my husband's estate. You were wrong on every count. Judge Hamilton cleared his throat, and Irene could see him fighting back a smile. Mr. Pierce, I think you might want to reconsider your strategy. You've just spent a day and a half calling one of the most brilliant legal minds in the state incompetent. Pierce sank into his chair, his legendary confidence completely shattered. Your Honor, Irene said, I request permission to call witnesses in my defense. Granted. And Mrs. Caldwell? Judge Hamilton's expression was serious now. Or should I say Judge Hartwell? It's good to see you back in a courtroom. Thank you, Your Honor, and it's just Irene now. I'm not on the bench anymore. Once a judge, always a judge, Hamilton said softly. Please proceed. Irene's first witness was Gloria Patterson. Her best friend took the stand with a determined expression, and Irene could see the pride in her eyes. Mrs. Patterson, how long have you known me? 42 years. We met in law school. A murmur went through the courtroom. Even this was news to Trevor. Can you describe what you observed during my marriage to Marcus Caldwell? Gloria's voice was steady and clear. I watched my best friend sacrifice everything for love. Irene was on track for the Supreme Court. Everyone knew it. But she met Marcus at a charity gala, and for the first time in her life, she wanted something more than the next case, the next ruling, the next achievement. Did I ever express any interest in Marcus's money? Never. In fact, you were horrified when you found out how wealthy he was. You almost didn't marry him because you were worried people would think you were a gold digger. Gloria's gaze swept across to Trevor. You were more concerned about protecting Marcus's relationship with his son than protecting your own financial security. Can you give an example? 2 years ago, you found out Marcus was planning to change his will to give you more. You begged him not to. You said Trevor would never forgive you if he thought you'd taken his inheritance. You asked Marcus to leave Trevor at least 40%. This was new information. Even Pierce looked startled. And what did Marcus say? Gloria's expression grew sad. He said, Trevor has already taken himself out of my will with his own behavior. This has nothing to do with you, Irene. This is about teaching my son consequences I should have taught him 30 years ago. Irene nodded. Thank you, Gloria. No further questions. Pierce declined to cross-examine. What could he say? Irene's second witness was James Mitchell, Marcus's attorney and financial advisor. Mr. Mitchell, you drafted Marcus's final will. Can you describe his mental state when you met with him? Crystal clear, sharp as ever. He knew exactly what he wanted and why. James looked at Trevor. In fact, Marcus insisted on video recording our discussion specifically in case the will was challenged. He said, and I quote, "My son is going to fight this. I want my reasoning on record." And did Marcus ever mention feeling pressured or influenced by anyone? Quite the opposite. He mentioned that Mrs. Caldwell had tried to talk him out of limiting Trevor's inheritance. She wanted family peace more than financial security. Irene produced a document. Mr. Mitchell, can you explain this to the court? James reviewed it. This is a draft will from 2 years ago. Marcus originally intended to leave 40% to Trevor and 60% to Mrs. Caldwell. And what changed? James's expression darkened. An incident. Marcus overheard Trevor on the phone saying he checked his notes. Just a few more weeks and the old man will be gone. Then I'll have enough to pay off everyone. The courtroom went silent. Trevor had gone white. Marcus was devastated. Not about the money, but about realizing his son was counting down the days until his death. That's when he changed the will to establish only a trust fund for Trevor. To punish him? No. James's voice was firm. To teach him. Marcus said, maybe if Trevor has to live within his means for once, he'll finally learn the value of money. It was a father's last attempt to teach his son responsibility. Pierce stood for cross-examination, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. Mr. Mitchell, isn't it true that Mrs. Caldwell stood to benefit financially from Marcus limiting Trevor's inheritance? In the short term, yes. In the long term, no. Marcus told me explicitly that Irene would have preferred family harmony over financial gain. He was making this decision despite her objections, not because of them. Pierce sat down, defeated. Irene's third witness was the one she'd been saving. The knockout punch. Your Honor, I'd like to play a video deposition. Marcus Caldwell's final testimony. Pierce was on his feet. Objection! The witness is deceased. The video was recorded with full legal protocol, witnessed, and notarized. Irene handed documents to the judge. It's admissible under Massachusetts Rules of Evidence 804B1 as a deposition of an unavailable witness. Judge Hamilton reviewed the documents. I'll allow it. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the bailiff set up the video screen. Marcus's face appeared, thin and pale, but with eyes that burned with determination. My name is Marcus Anthony Caldwell, his recorded voice began. I am 70 years old, diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and I am making this statement voluntarily and of sound mind. The camera pulled back to show a notary and Dr. Patricia Wells sitting beside Marcus, confirming the date and his cognitive capacity. I'm making this recording because I know my son Trevor will contest my will after I die, and I want the court to hear the truth directly from me. Marcus looked directly at the camera, and Irene felt tears prick her eyes. Trevor, if you're watching this, I love you. I always have. But love doesn't mean enabling. I've spent 35 years bailing you out, making excuses for you, pretending your failures were just bad luck. I was a terrible father because I never taught you consequences. He pulled out a folder. You've borrowed $137,000 from me over 15 years. You've never repaid a penny. The last loan was for casino debts. You called me at 2 a.m. crying, saying you'd lose your apartment. I paid. Again. Marcus's voice hardened. 2 weeks later, I heard you on the phone. You thought I was asleep. You said just a few more weeks and the old man will finally die. Then I'll have enough to cover everything. You were literally counting down the days until your father's death. Trevor made a strangled sound. Several jurors were wiping their eyes. So I changed the will, not to punish you, but to save you. You're getting a trust fund because I pray that living within your means will teach you what I couldn't, that character matters more than inheritance. Marcus's expression softened as he looked off camera. Irene, wherever you are right now, I'm sorry you have to go through this. You deserve better. He turned back to the camera. Let me be absolutely clear for the court. Irene never manipulated me, never pressured me, never even asked about my will. She gave up a brilliant legal career to build a life with me and Trevor. She was Judge Irene Hartwell, one of the most respected jurists in Massachusetts. She sacrificed everything for love. Marcus leaned forward, his voice fierce despite his weakness. If anyone manipulated anyone in this family, it was me manipulating Irene into believing she had to be small and quiet to be loved. She didn't. She never did. My will stands as written. Irene earned every penny through 20 years of devotion. Trevor earned his trust fund through every wasted opportunity I gave him. And to the court, if my son is challenging this will, it's not because he was wronged. It's because he can't accept that his own choices have consequences. The video ended. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Trevor crying, ugly, gasping sobs that shook his whole body. Judge Hamilton cleared his throat roughly. Mr. Pierce, do you wish to cross-examine this testimony? Pierce looked at Trevor, who was collapsed in his chair. No, Your Honor, no questions. Mrs. Caldwell, do you have additional evidence? One more item, Your Honor. Irene pulled out her final document. Trevor Caldwell's financial records, subpoenaed this morning, showing $180,000 in current gambling debts to 3 different casinos. The reason he needs this inheritance isn't grief, it's desperation. She turned to face Trevor directly. You're not here because you miss your father or because you feel cheated. You're here because you're broke and drowning in debt you created yourself. And you thought bullying your stepmother, the stupid housewife, would be easier than facing your own failures. Trevor couldn't look at her. Irene's voice softened. I spent 20 years trying to earn your love, Trevor. I failed. But not because I didn't try hard enough. Because you were determined to see me as the enemy instead of as someone who genuinely cared about you. She turned back to Judge Hamilton. Your Honor, I move for dismissal of all charges and for judgment in favor of the defendant, myself, with the will upheld in its entirety. Mr. Pierce? Judge Hamilton's voice was icy. Do you wish to present any rebuttal? Pierce stood slowly. He looked at Trevor, then at Irene, then at the judge. No, Your Honor. In light of the evidence presented, the plaintiff wishes to withdraw the lawsuit. Motion denied, Judge Hamilton said sharply. You filed this lawsuit making serious allegations about Mrs. Caldwell's character and competence. We're going to see this through to a verdict. He turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, based on the evidence presented, do you require deliberation or have you reached a verdict? The jury foreman, a woman in her 50s, stood. We have a verdict, Your Honor. We find that the will of Marcus Caldwell should be upheld in its entirety. There is no evidence of undue influence, fraud, or diminished capacity. The defendant is entitled to her full inheritance. Judge Hamilton nodded. So ordered. Furthermore, he turned to Trevor. Mr. Caldwell, the court finds that your lawsuit was frivolous and brought in bad faith. You are ordered to pay Mrs. Caldwell's legal fees and court costs. He banged his gavel. This case is dismissed. Court is adjourned. As people began filing out, Irene remained standing at her table, suddenly exhausted. She'd won. Completely. Decisively. But as she watched Trevor being led out by Pierce, His shoulders shaking with sobs, she felt no triumph. Only sadness for what might have been. Judge Hamilton approached her table as the courtroom emptied. "Judge Hartwell, Irene, that was remarkable. You haven't lost a step." "Thank you, Your Honor." "Have you considered returning to practice? The legal community would welcome you back." Irene looked at Marcus's empty chair in the gallery, where he would have sat if he'd been alive to see this. "I think I might. There are a lot of women who need someone to fight for them. Women who've been dismissed as just housewives when there's so much more." Hamilton smiled. "The world needs more attorneys like you. Welcome back to the arena, Judge." As he left, Gloria rushed forward and pulled Irene into a fierce hug. "You magnificent woman. You glorious, brilliant, magnificent woman." Irene hugged her back, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. She'd won, not just the case, but something more important. She'd found herself again. The courtroom had just begun to empty when the doors burst open. A woman in her early 40s strode in, dressed in an expensive business suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun. She carried a leather briefcase and the kind of confidence that came from practice, not breeding. "Your Honor," she called out, "I need to file an emergency motion in this case." Judge Hamilton, who had been gathering his papers, looked up sharply. "Court is adjourned. If you have a motion, file it through proper channels. I'm Victoria Langford." She set her briefcase on the plaintiff's table with a thud. "Marcus Caldwell's daughter, and I'm contesting this will." The courtroom, half empty now, froze. Reporters who'd been leaving rushed back to their seats. Even Pierce, who'd been helping a devastated Trevor toward the door, stopped. Irene felt ice slide down her spine. She'd known this was coming, but not this soon. Not this publicly. "Ms. Langford," Judge Hamilton said, his voice edged with irritation. "This case has been decided. If you have a separate claim, I have proof." Victoria pulled out a folder. "DNA evidence showing I'm Marcus Caldwell's biological daughter. My mother was Sarah Langford. They were married briefly in 1985 before an annulment. I was given up for adoption, but I've found the records. I have a right to part of this estate." Trevor was staring at her, his grief momentarily forgotten. "I have a sister?" "Half-sister," Victoria corrected. "And I'm here to claim what should have been mine all along." Irene stood slowly. She'd prepared for this, but the courtroom drama of it, the timing, was designed to maximize chaos. Victoria was good. "Your Honor," Irene said calmly, "may I approach?" Hamilton gestured her forward. Victoria and Irene met at the bench, and for the first time Irene could see the calculation in the other woman's eyes. This wasn't about family. This was business. "Ms. Langford," Irene said quietly, "I've been expecting you." Victoria's confident smile faltered slightly. "In fact," Irene continued, pulling documents from her own briefcase, "I've been investigating you for the past 3 days. Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence that Ms. Langford is a professional inheritance scammer who has filed identical claims in Nevada, California, and Arizona." She handed the papers to Judge Hamilton. "Private investigator reports, court records showing her previous fraudulent claims, and most importantly, DNA test results from Marcus Caldwell's estate attorney, conducted 1 year ago when Ms. Langford first made contact. The test proves she has 0 genetic relation to Marcus Caldwell." Victoria's face went white. "That test was inconclusive." "The test you provided was fake," Irene said, her voice hardening with the authority of 15 years on the bench. "The one Marcus's attorney conducted, with your discarded coffee cup from your meeting, was real. You're not Marcus's daughter. You never were." She turned to Judge Hamilton. "Furthermore, Your Honor, I have email evidence showing Ms. Langford threatened Marcus 3 months before his death. She said, and I quote, 'If you won't give it to me willingly, I'll take it by force.'" Irene produced the printed email. "I believe Ms. Langford has been watching this case, waiting for her opportunity. She may have even encouraged Trevor's lawsuit, knowing it would create chaos she could exploit." Judge Hamilton's expression had gone from irritated to furious. "Ms. Langford, is this true?" Victoria backed away from the bench, her confidence crumbling. This is all circumstantial. I have rights. Bailiff? Hamilton's voice cracked like a whip. Detain Ms. Langford. I am holding her in contempt pending investigation of fraud charges. As the bailiff moved forward, Victoria made a desperate grab for her briefcase. But Irene was faster. 20 years older, but she'd spent those years gardening and staying active. She caught Victoria's wrist. I was a judge for 15 years, Irene said softly, so only Victoria could hear. I've seen 100 scammers like you. You made one critical mistake. What? You threatened someone I loved. That made it personal. Irene released her wrist. Officers! As Victoria was led away, shouting about her rights and demanding her attorney, the courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters were on their phones. Court watchers were buzzing with excited conversation. Trevor sank back into his chair, looking shell-shocked. I don't understand what just happened. Pierce sat beside him, equally stunned. I think your stepmother just saved you from a much worse legal battle. Judge Hamilton banged his gavel repeatedly. Order! Order in this court! When the room finally quieted, he looked at Irene with something approaching awe. Mrs. Caldwell, how long have you known about Ms. Langford? 3 days, Your Honor. I found her email to Marcus and started investigating immediately. I wanted to be prepared in case she made an appearance. You've been practicing law again for all of 3 days, and you've already taken down a professional scammer. Hamilton shook his head. Remind me never to face you in court. A ripple of laughter went through the gallery. Now, Hamilton said, his voice returning to its formal tone. Are there any other surprise claimants who'd like to disrupt my courtroom today? Silence. Excellent. Then my previous ruling stands. This case is dismissed. Court is adjourned. He banged the gavel with finality. After the courtroom cleared, only 4 people remained. Irene, Trevor, Pierce, and Gloria. Trevor sat slumped in his chair, his expensive suit wrinkled, his eyes red from crying. He looked smaller than Irene had ever seen him. Defeated. Lost. Trevor, Irene said quietly. He didn't look up. I need to say something to you. Haven't you said enough? His voice was hollow. You won. You proved I'm a failure, that my own father thought I was worthless. Congratulations. Irene walked around the table and sat in the chair beside him. Pierce started to object, then thought better of it and stayed silent. Your father never thought you were worthless, Irene said. He thought you were lost. There's a difference. Trevor laughed bitterly. He left me a trust fund like I'm a child who can't be trusted with money. Because I can't be. You heard the evidence? I owe $180,000 to casinos. I'm a gambling addict with no job and no future. He knew exactly what I was. He knew what you'd become. But he believed you could still change. Why? I never gave him any reason to believe that. Irene took a breath, choosing her words carefully. When I married your father, you were 12 years old. You'd just lost your mother. And suddenly here I was, this stranger trying to be part of your family. You called me the replacement. Trevor flinched. For 20 years, you made it clear you didn't want me there. You forgot my birthday every single year. You came home for Christmas and spent the entire time on your phone. When your father asked you about me, you'd change the subject. I know, Trevor whispered. I was cruel to you. You were a child processing grief the only way you knew how. And I failed you, Trevor. I should have fought harder for a real relationship with you. Instead, I let you push me away because I thought that's what you needed. She pulled out a document from her briefcase. Your father established a trust fund of $24,000 per year. That's not a lot, but it's steady. Enough to live on if you're careful. I heard the terms. I'll be broke in 6 months. That depends. Irene slid the paper toward him. Judge Hamilton ordered you to repay the $137,000 you borrowed from your father. That would take you decades on a trust fund income. Trevor's eyes filled with tears again. I know. I'll probably have to declare bankruptcy. Maybe that's what I deserve. Or, Irene said softly, you could accept my offer. Trevor looked up, confused. I'm willing to forgive the debt entirely. All $137,000, written off completely. Why would you do that? Because your father loved you, even when you made it impossible. And because I spent 20 years trying to be your mother. I failed at that, but maybe I can succeed at being the person who gives you a second chance. Trevor stared at the document. What's the catch? No catch, just conditions. Irene pulled out another paper. You enroll in a certified financial management program. You attend Gamblers Anonymous meetings. You maintain steady employment for 1 year. If you do those 3 things, the debt is forgiven. And if I don't? Then you owe the money, with interest. Irene's voice was firm. But Trevor, I don't want your father's last gift to you to be a lesson in failure. I want it to be a lesson in redemption. He believed you could change. I'd like to believe that too. Trevor was openly crying now. I don't deserve this. None of us deserve grace, Irene said quietly, but we all need it. She stood to leave, but Trevor caught her hand. Irene, I'm sorry. For everything. For the lawsuit. For the things I said about you. For wasting 20 years hating you when you were just trying to love me. I know you are. Irene squeezed his hand gently. And I accept your apology. But more importantly, you need to forgive yourself. That's going to be the hardest part. As she walked toward the door where Gloria waited, Trevor called out, Irene? She turned. My father was right about you. You are stronger than you look. He wiped his eyes. And I think maybe you could help me learn to be strong too. Irene smiled, sad but genuine. I think that's something you'll have to learn yourself, Trevor, but I'll be here if you need help along the way. 6 months later, the brass nameplate on the door read, Caldwell Legal Advocacy, Protecting the Underestimated. Irene stood in her new office on the 3rd floor of a renovated brownstone in downtown Boston. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the common. Marcus's photograph sat on her desk, next to her old gavel from her judging days, a gift from Judge Hamilton. Your 3 o'clock is here, her assistant called through the intercom. Send her in. Rachel Morrison entered hesitantly, a woman in her early 60s, well-dressed, but with the hunted look Irene had come to recognize. The look of someone being dismissed, diminished, told she was just something. Mrs. Morrison, please sit. Rachel settled into the chair, clutching her purse. I'm not sure you can help me. My situation is complicated. Irene smiled. I've learned that the most complicated situations often have the simplest solutions. Tell me what's happening. My husband died 3 months ago. We were married 18 years. His children from his first marriage are contesting the will. They're saying I manipulated him, that I'm a gold digger. Rachel's voice broke. They called me a home-wrecking housewife in court documents. Irene opened her notepad, feeling the familiar fire kindle in her chest. Tell me everything, and I mean everything. Don't leave anything out. 2 hours later, after Rachel left with a legal strategy and renewed hope, Gloria appeared in the doorway with coffee and pastries. Another one? Another one, Irene confirmed. That's the 5th case this month. All widows whose stepchildren are contesting wills, all being called incompetent housewives. Word is spreading. You're becoming legendary again. Gloria set down the coffee. How does it feel? Exhausting. Exhilarating. Right. Irene took a sip of coffee. I spent 20 years being invisible. Now I'm visible again, and it turns out I'd forgotten how much I missed it. And Trevor? Irene pulled up her phone and showed Gloria a text message from that morning. 4 months sober from gambling. Got promoted to senior accountant. Taking my GA chip today. Thank you for believing I could change. T. He's doing the work, Irene said. I see him once a month for coffee. It's still awkward, but it's real. For the first time in 20 years, we're actually talking to each other. Gloria squeezed her shoulder. Marcus would be proud. Of both of you. I hope so. Irene looked at Marcus's photograph. I think he knew this would happen. That I'd find my way back to who I was. Or maybe find a way to be both. The woman who loved enough to sacrifice everything, and the judge who fights for people who can't fight for themselves. Her phone buzzed with a new message. Judge Hamilton, have a case I think you'd be interested in. Pro bono work for women's shelter. Eviction defense. You available? Irene typed back. Absolutely. Send me the details. She looked out the window at the city she'd once ruled from a courtroom bench. She was different now. Softer in some ways, harder in others. She'd learned that strength didn't mean never bending. It meant knowing when to bend and when to stand firm. She'd been Judge Irene Hartwell. She'd been Mrs. Marcus Caldwell. Now she was simply Irene, attorney, advocate, widow, and survivor. And she was exactly where she belonged. Irene walked into the same courtroom where everything had changed. The wood paneling was still dark with age. The air conditioning still didn't quite work. But she was different. She wore a sharp charcoal suit, not trying to look small anymore, but commanding the space she occupied. Her briefcase was new, expensive, full of airtight legal arguments. Her client, a 70-year-old widow whose stepson was trying to have her declared incompetent, sat beside her with quiet confidence. They'd prepared well. The opposing counsel was young, cocky, fresh from a big firm. He stood for his opening statement and immediately went for the jugular. Your Honor, my client's stepmother is clearly suffering from diminished capacity. She's 70 years old, has no business experience, has been just a housewife her entire adult life. Judge Hamilton, presiding again, cleared his throat loudly. Counselor, I'm going to stop you right there. The young attorney looked confused. Your Honor? Do you know who you're facing? Mrs. Caldwell is representing the defendant, but... Mrs. Caldwell, Hamilton interrupted, was Judge Irene Hartwell, Superior Court, 15 years on the bench. One of the most brilliant legal minds I've ever encountered. She's going to demolish your case in approximately... He checked his watch. 37 minutes. That's her record. The young attorney went pale. And furthermore, Hamilton continued, his voice carrying a warning, if I ever hear you use the phrase, just a housewife in my courtroom again, I'll hold you in contempt. Being a homemaker requires more intelligence, organization, and multitasking ability than most corporate jobs. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor. Irene stood, fighting back a smile. Your Honor, I believe we can resolve this even faster than 37 minutes. I have a video deposition from the defendant's doctor, cognitive assessment results, and financial records proving my client has been managing a complex estate portfolio for 30 years with exceptional competence. She paused, letting her words land. And I have something else. A statement from the plaintiff's former therapist, authorized for release, showing he has a documented pattern of financially exploiting elderly relatives. The opposing counsel sank into his chair. 2 hours later, Irene walked out of the courthouse with another complete victory. Her client hugged her fiercely before heading home. As Irene stood on the courthouse steps, briefcase in hand, she saw Trevor waiting by the street. He'd driven in from his new apartment to watch the hearing. You were incredible in there, he said, falling into step beside her. Just like Dad said you were. Your father was biased. Maybe, but he was also right. Trevor hesitated. Listen, I'm meeting my GA sponsor for coffee. Would you want to join us? I'd like you to meet him. Irene stopped, surprised. In all their monthly coffee meetings over the past year, Trevor had never invited her into his recovery process. This was new territory. I'd like that, she said. As they walked together, not quite family, not quite friends, but something in between, Irene thought about the journey that had brought her here. From Judge Hartwell to Mrs. Caldwell to just Irene, and finally to all three at once. She'd been a housewife. She'd been a judge. She was both. She was neither. And she was done apologizing for any of it. Behind them, the courthouse stood solid and imposing, witness to thousands of stories of justice and mercy, victory and defeat. Irene's story was just one among many, but it was hers, and she'd fought for every chapter.